Okay, just got back from DC, and my wife is about to give the dog a bath. You can hear that in the background. I'm having some coffee and looking at all the goodies that came in while I was out of town. For instance, these two boards, these turret boards. This one is for that Marshall, the 76 Marshall that we're rebuilding. Notice the very thick, rigid fiberglass, the very good turrets. Lots of spacing between things, and after I transfer the mounting locations for the existing hardware to it, then I can begin wiring the back of the board, all the jumpers and stuff, and then we'll start populating this, and we'll show that, and that will be cool. Also, in for that Marshall, the new correct 3 Henry choke, which has a much better feel for rock and blues based Marshall goodness. If you're playing a lot of really fast speed metal, etc., whatever you call the genre that you prefer, and you really want a lot of crisp articulation as opposed to like a note bloom, then the 10 Henry chokes can be really nice. But for most guys looking for the Zepp, Allman Brothers, Hendrix, Van Halen stuff, 3 Henry to 3.x Henry is the target range. So this will be good, and that non-original Parmico will go away. I'm going to put this Marshall board to the side until I can transfer some measurements. Here is the board for the AC-15 project, the Excalibur 15. More on that to come, both in this video and a second video. Again, very high quality fiberglass, very thick. Everything's heavy duty. Everything is overbuilt, which means the amp will have none of the issues which are so common. Hey, and there's our oven singing, saying it's ready for our frozen pizza. We just got back in and we're digging through the freezer for something to eat. I'm sure you know the drill. And I'll get all the dust off. That's no big deal. So that's nice. Let me show you the next groovy thing. Got a care package from Mercury. So here's the power transformer. And this first one is getting the power transformer, which is the version made to replace 60s. And it's pretty straightforward. The other ones after this are going to have the same transformer with one additional 5-volt tap, which I will use to generate a DC supply as needed for switching circuits. Most of them will not have it in use, but if someone wants channel switching, remote boost, etc., I'll be able to use those taps for that. Otherwise, they'll be left unconnected. And this is a nice solid piece of gear. I have not decided whether it's going to go this way or the other way, but it fits on this orientation. And remember that the coil is going in this direction, which brings us to a couple of weaknesses of the Mojo Tone chassis that I'm having to use to keep the cost reasonable. First of all, Mojo Tone's output transformer is like this. This is actually the choke for this. More on that in a moment. So Mojo Tone mounts theirs like this, and that would work fine if you have the Mojo Tone, but they're actually using a different thing, and they have their coil on the same axis as the axis of the power transformer, which sometimes you can get away with and sometimes not. This is a bad example of that because this is oriented differently within the frame than the Mojo Tone one is. I'm going to put this choke to the side, and I'll put this Mercury output transformer, the VXP15AL, which gives me different secondary taps to play with. And if I mounted this the way Mojo Tone mounts theirs, then we might have a problem. I don't know. I'll have to test that to see if there is induced hum from the power transformer, which means I'll have to wire up the primary connections on this power transformer. and then wire up the secondary of the output transformer to headphones and listen. And I want to make sure that when power is applied to the primary of the power transformer, no hum is induced in the secondary of the output transformer. And sometimes you can get away with this where they're both on the same plane, but usually it is best to mount like so that this coil is going in this direction and this coil is going in this direction. Much more on this in the Blues Breaker videos from 6 months or more back, where the stock amp was noisy because Marshall did not orient the output transformer correctly. So let's say that I have this here and this here. Well, where do I place the choke? That's the next thing. Mojo-Tone, actually in their design, does not use a choke. They just mount a 10-watt resistor on the positives of this multi-section capacitor, which in their design is, that's the reservoir on the screen. They just have a resistor instead of a choke, so there's no big thing. In others, they suggest mounting a choke here, and they sell a tiny little choke that fits there. Well, I don't have a tiny little choke. I ordered the Mercury VXC, which is a reproduction of what was actually in the early 60s, and this is 10 Henry, 100 ohms DCR. And as you can see, it's quite large. This is the size of the ones that they used in the 60s. Now, if this were a 60s one, you might think at first that, oh, well, that's going to be over there, and then that's going to be over there. And that's true to an extent, but the originals had an L-shaped frame. The chassis was L-shaped, and while it was fragile and prone to bending and all kinds of not fun things, it did move the input jacks quite a bit farther from the output transformer than in this setup, and there was a lot of metal between them. If I were to mount it like this, let me pause this and flip the chassis around. And this is similar in some ways to how Vox laid out the AC-15 chassis. Then in this chassis, which is not an L shape, there's no two sections of the chassis with a metal shield between them. Then this output transformer is way too close to these input jacks, and that can induce hum into the input. You really don't want a high-level signal from the output of the amplifier to go physically near to the input of the amplifier. So we'll move the choke and say that we probably either want to have the output transformer as close to the power transformer as orientation and proximity will allow, in which case the choke could go here, or we move this farther away, squeeze the choke in between, and then pull this back. And that doesn't look as cool, maybe, but I want to keep a distance from the input jacks and the output transformer. Now this is a tight squeeze, but if I don't have any induced hum with this, and this can actually serve to block hum from being induced from the power transformer to the output transformer, this can work. I'm going to call my buddy Patrick at Mercury tomorrow and see if they sell a smaller 10 Henry 100 milliamp. Did I say 100 ohms earlier? Yeah, I did. Damn it. 10 Henry 100 milliamp choke. I'm also going to look at some calculations and see what the current draw of an AC-15 really is, because the 100 milliamps is crazy over ratings for what the amp actually draws. And it may be that I could get away with a 8 to 10 Henry 50 milliamp smaller choke and have more flexibility in the layout. A cathode biased amp draws more current than a fixed bias amp of the same potential wattage. Let's just simplify it and say that. So there's always going to be quite a bit of current draw, but remember, Vox was not having transformers made for them in the 60s. They were using off-the-shelf stuff that worked. So they had a 20 Henry 100 milliamp choke for the AC30. Sometimes they'd use one that was a 200 milliamp choke based on availability. But they use a 10 Henry 100 milliamp choke on the AC15. So half the inductance, but the same current rating. And I know that I could potentially go to a lower current choke and buy myself some chassis real estate without affecting the sound. If this were not trying to get some of the historic sounds, particularly on the EF86 channel, where the entire amp is working in concert for overdrive, this is not just preamp distortion that you hear, I might say, oh, a resistor would make sense, and I can emulate a choke fairly well with a resistor. But in an AC15 derived circuit with the cathode bias, to get the compression right, to get the right-hand feel just right, to get the bloom right, I have to be very careful deviating from what they did. So let me move this to the side now. I'm going to just pause this and move all this out of the way. All right, I'm going to try to do this next bit with the chassis balanced on my lap. So I've got those knobs in that are ordered. And I'm going to emulate the look of the top boost amp. So, volume, treble, bass, then they go to the cut, and then the others. We get one more for this. So we have volume, treble, bass, level, color. I think this is going to look really nice. Now this is going to be a gray anodized aluminum, almost black panel with a gray graphic, a very pale gray that will almost look white. I think this thing's going to look sharp. So this was the way I could get all the controls I wanted in the amp without having everything squeezed or having it be just exaggeratedly wide. And remember, the bass knob will be a pull for mid boost. So I'm thinking this thing's going to be sweet. One other consideration I need to mention in this video. Okay, and that's on the inside. Not only do I need to have the output transformer and choke mount exactly where I want them to be, but I have to make sure that the mounting hardware for those does not interfere with the mounting hardware for this board. Let me get this board lined up pretty much where it's going to be. That's roughly right. So I'm going to have mounting hardware here and here, and I believe here and here. I think I've got another one, maybe this one and this one. I'd have to look at my graphic. 6 is overkill, and in future ones I will only have 4 mounting holes on this, just because this board material is so thick it won't need 6. The Marshall has 6 or 8, I don't recall off the top of my head. I think 6. This first AC15, this first Excalibur 15 will have 6 mounting points. Future ones will only have 4. It just makes the build simpler, and it's just as rugged because this stuff has no flex to it whatsoever, and this is not going to bend or warp. This stuff is rigid as can be. This is really high quality stuff. Doug Hoffman at Hoffman Amps does the boards for me. I do the design, I send him the computer file, he sends the boards to me. It works out really well for all of us. And this thing is going to be gorgeous inside and out. But if you'll excuse me, I've got a lot of math to do. And once I temporarily affix the board to the chassis, then I will know better where exactly I can mount the output transformer and choke, though I'm going to wait until I talk to Patrick tomorrow at Mercury on some other choke options. Hope you guys like this stuff. This is almost quite literally the nuts and bolts behind the scenes stuff that you have to take in consideration. And that's why I'm having to use a Mojo Tone chassis. It can be frustrating. Oh, one other thing about that. I guess I should mention this now. It is a source of great irritation to me that Mojo Tone does this chassis with a square opening for a press-in IEC rather than a IEC receptacle that is screwed to the chassis. And this opening for the press-in is just smaller in each dimension than the one for a IEC that is screwed in. And I prefer the screw in. I think it's a much more secure connection. And I have made the press-ins work, and they are reliable as such things go. But it is not something that I would ever choose. Let me show you something. Well, I thought I had a screw-in IEC connector to compare to this press-in IEC connector. If I do, I can't find it. I probably do. As you might have noticed in the past couple of videos, my desk has gotten very cluttered. And after I upload this video, before I do anything else, I'm going to clean up my work area, the desk, my other desk, everything that's on the floor, everything that's just kind of got jumbled as I work. This is the one that fits this, and it just kind of clicks in place. I'm not going to do it right now because you can only do it so many times without fatiguing the metal. But the issue I found is that unless you use a very thick rear panel, and sometimes even if you do, it can have a little bit of wiggle to it. And that's not a good feeling with IEC connections. Now, some guys will then use glue or silicone or all kinds of stuff to make sure it stays solid. That makes an eventual repair more difficult. My preference would be to have a really nice routing table and a jig set up just so I could take one of these chassis and easily and quickly enlarge it. It's like a 0.4 millimeter difference to take the screwed one, and I don't have that, and doing it by hand can add quite a bit of time with Dremel and then smoothing it. So I'm probably going to see if there's any way I can make this reliable without a whole bunch of adhesive stuff on the inside. There's nothing inherently wrong with this. It depends on a lot of variations in the metal thickness and stuff. And I just don't have the same confidence in this that I will have in every other thing in this amp that I'm putting together. So I'm going to think on this a bit more. I've already spoken to the guys at Mojo Tone. This costs about 50 cents less than a higher quality screw-in. And aside from the fact that they'd have to retool their stamps, though I know that some of their JTM 45 chassis do have the screw-in already, this is just a cheap thing to do, and they can do better than this. If I wasn't wanting to be able to sell these to people in the UK or Japan or Europe, I could just cover this up with a big logo plate and use a hardwired cable like on an old Fender. But the IEC allows me to know that the amp is going to work at whatever voltage it's set to with the correct fuses accordingly. And then the owner can provide their own power cable, IEC cable with a plug for their particular country. And it makes the amp a lot more flexible, and I don't have to stock a UK plug, a Belgian plug, an Australian plug if there's any difference, I don't know, a Japanese plug if there's any difference. I have to look all this stuff up. It's a lot to keep track of. I'm not a large company, I'm me, and I may be large, but I'm working on it. On that note, and the Mojotone design, they expected there to be a rotary impedance switch here and 2 output jacks. And here's the kind of impedance switch a lot of people use for this. It is fine for switching a lot of things. I would not put the current, even of a 15 watt amp, through this. I don't like it. I don't find it reliable. That's what someone did in that 76 Marshall. And the one, that 76 Marshall, is getting replaced with this one here, which is a much higher quality, higher current part. And I could use this on this, but this is about a $12 part, and it bothers me because they drilled the opening too large for it. This is a standard 3/8 bushing, and they drilled that out to almost half an inch. So on so many of these, it just kind of floats around on these Mojotone chassis. This won't float around quite so much in the Marshall, though I've got to do some tricks to the Marshall. Actually, I might use a different trick on fixing that Marshall. We'll get to that. That's in the later video, obviously. So what I think I'm going to do on this one is not have a rotary impedance selector switch. This will get covered up by the new rear panel. And the new rear panel will have 3 jack holes, evenly spaced. So here, here, and here. And there'll be 16 ohms, 8 ohms, 8 ohms. So if you're just using a combo with a 116 ohm cab, you plug in here. If you have 2 16 ohm cabs, you plug in here and here, or an 8 ohm cab, you plug in here. It's very simple. It takes a $12 switch out of the equation. It saves a lot of money. It's very easy for me to drill one round hole here in each chassis versus enlarging this. And I will do a resistor trick on the inside so that if someone were to forget to plug the amp in, the amp would not explode. Trust me on that. I'll explain that later. It's no big deal. It's a 10 watt resistor used correctly and chosen properly and carefully. But I will make sure that even though there is no impedance selector switch, and therefore I cannot have the output which grounds itself a la Fender, it will still have protection built in. So I'm looking forward to getting to all this. But first, I've got a lot of cleaning and reorganizing to do so I can find stuff. Maybe all that willpower to do that is at the bottom of that cup of coffee. I will soon find out.